So I think I just pass over the word to you, Alice, and please introduce yourself, because you are a celebrity in this community, but not for all. So yeah, please tell us a little bit about your background.
Well, that is part of my talk, actually. So first of all, I wanted to just say how, let's see, get this correct here. I wish that we could all be present in person, but I'm actually really grateful to Zoom now that that makes it possible to speak to people, to all of you in so many different places. That's really amazing. And I want to thank especially Astrid and Philippa for extending the invitation in the first place. So, you know, I am a member of a Huntington's family. I want to say that I am actually now in New York rather than at my home in California, I'm staying with my sister and on computers and technology that I'm not actually so used to. So if I stop for a second to adjust things, that's the reason. So as Astrid said, I am part of a family with Huntington's and a family involved with advocacy and with the search for a cure. As the sister of Nancy Wexler, as I think all of you know, led the team that found the gene and for Huntington's and did so much to advance really understanding of this illness. I'm the daughter of a mother with Huntington's, Leonore Wexler, who was actually taught biology in high school when she was young and developed Huntington's, and Milton Wexler, my dad, who dedicated the last part of his life really to organizing and funding research for treatment through the Hereditary Disease Foundation that he started in the late 1960s. And I'm also a historian who has studied and written about Huntington's and its history. So, I mean, we joke that Huntington's is almost a family business, you know, and we're involved in it in both the painful parts and the more positive parts as well. So again, I'm going to start with a little personal history, how it unfolded in our family, what I've learned over the years living as a woman at risk alongside my sister, who now has gone public about having Huntington's disease, and some thoughts about the future, especially in light of the ending of the clinical trials. But as Herbig said, we're not starting over. We've learned a huge amount, and we're going to learn a lot more in the near future. So Nancy and I actually grew up not knowing anything about Huntington's in our mother's family, and one of the reasons was geography. They all lived on the east coast of the United States. We lived in California, 3,000 miles away. So we actually didn't see our relatives very much. But another reason, of course, was the stigma surrounding Huntington's and the fact that it was kept secret in the family. And I think as I've gotten older and learned more about it, I can become more sympathetic and understanding of why it was a secret. I think my mother always said, my mother didn't tell my father about Huntington's and her family, although she knew what her father had died by that time. And Huntington's, he died in 1929. And Huntington's was actually quite well known among neurologists and geneticists, even then. And his death certificate says Korea Huntington, even then. So she knew. But if she told my father, I think at that time when they were courting, which was in the 1930s, I think he probably wouldn't have married her. If he had gone to a neurologist or a physician who knew anything about Huntington's, they would have advised her, don't get married, don't have children. Maybe she would have been advised to get sterilized. And I think, you know, to have children when this was in your family, when you were at risk, was often considered socially irresponsible. And that was, you know, up until the 1970s, that was really the advice that young people got from neurologists who actually understood the hereditary pattern and knew about it. And I think when you think, especially also birth control is very difficult to access, abortion illegal, and I'm speaking of the United States. That really meant don't get married if you didn't want to have children. And I wanted to mention, we often think that those with the most knowledge have the most enlightened attitude toward illness and disability. But that's not always the case. And I think historically in the United States, anyway, the doctors and scientists who knew the most about Huntington's were often the most insistent about sterilization, especially from the 1900s up until the 1970s. And what changed things wasn't any new scientific or medical discovery, it was advocacy on the part of families, including my own, who began to organize and educate themselves and physicians about what Huntington's was. Now, I want to say when my sister and I found out, when my mother was diagnosed in 1968, my father at that point, he knew about it, that my mother was affected. He had known before that actually too, but we didn't learn until her diagnosis. And he told us all the facts straight out. And my sister embraced it. She was about to start graduate school, and she made Huntington's the topic of her study. She was getting a PhD in psychology at the University of Michigan. I was in the middle of graduate studies in history, in Latin American history, actually. And I didn't want to have anything to do with it. I just ran as far away as possible. I think we were both really lucky in that our dad didn't call us home to take care of our mother. Our parents were divorced by that time. And I think it often happens, not just in Huntington's families, but in general, that it's expected that the girls are going to take care of relatives who are ill. Our dad, I wouldn't say he was exactly a feminist, but he did want us to pursue our education. And he took on the responsibility of our mother's care, even though he didn't live with her. It wasn't hands-on care, but he found places for her to live. He oversaw her medical treatment and doctors and all that stuff, so that we could, and we visited and we helped, but we didn't have to come. We didn't have to leave the university and go home. So we both feel very grateful for that, and hope that maybe with younger generations, there's no longer that assumption that caregiving is just a woman's responsibility. It's both women and men. And I know that's true in the HT families that I've met. I've met numbers of men who also have been very involved with caregiving. So fast forward to today, when we still, after all this time, we still don't have a way to prevent or stop or slow down Huntington's in its tracks. But I do think we have many options that weren't available, and a lot of knowledge that we didn't have in the past, like all the medications that can really help with depression, with anxiety, with the chorea, actually, with OCD that sometimes comes with HD. We know that therapy, many of these things are good for people in general, actually. Physical therapy and psychological therapy, counseling, for both people living with the symptoms and for the people taking care of them and relatives. These things can really be helpful in improving quality of life. Good nutrition, lots of exercise, and social interactions and activity, which I think is so important, because I think loneliness and isolation can be really harmful in themselves, harmful physically, not as well as mentally. I saw that with my mom, and who I think probably died of loneliness as much as she did of Huntington's at that time. So I think that this idea of social interaction, social support, social connection, which you were talking about, Hervig, before, and being connected to a team, and feeling that you have a place to go for help just can make a tremendous difference. I think actually, churches and synagogues and mosques can be really an important source of community also. But other kinds of community action or anything that keeps people connected and helps to ward off that loneliness and despair. And of course, there's also the issues of poverty, and in different parts of the world, this is a continuing challenge. Certain parts of Latin America, especially, but even in the United States, a rich country, Huntington's can be very impoverishing. And the inequality is a larger social issue here. It's a tremendous issue, and that affects families with Huntington's too. And so all the best care, there's excellent care available, but it's not always accessible to people for economic as well as social reasons. So of course, I want to say a little bit about pre-symptomatic genetic testing also, which is one of the big changes that we have today. That availability, at least in some parts of the world, not everywhere, began to be available in the mid-1980s, not even before the gene was discovered, when the genetic marker was discovered. And for those of you not familiar, the genetic marker was a little piece of DNA right next to the Huntington's gene. And that was usually transmitted together in families with HD. So for a few years after 1983, the marker could be a proxy for the gene. So you could test for the genetic marker. But then the test became much more accurate after 1993, when the actual gene itself was identified. I think it's interesting that right after the marker was discovered, there was a lot of demand from families for access to this test. People really wanted to know, and they wanted to get tested. And I've heard many reports of people who've said, as soon as I heard about this test, I knew immediately that I was going to take it. They felt that they had to take it. And there were people who got tested early on and found that they were liberated from really a lifetime of worry and anxiety, that they could have children without that particular anxiety or enjoy the children that they already had. But there were many others who got a different result. And I think a much more difficult challenge to live with. And as time went on, I think people in the HD community became more aware of the complexity of the pre-symptomatic test and the ramifications of living with a positive gene test when there was no medical treatment to prevent the disease, and there was possibility of discrimination in insurance and employment and even in love, really. And the demand diminished somewhat. So the reports that I've seen today indicate that fewer than around 20% of people at risk have chosen to get the pre-symptomatic test, although I think this number varies quite a bit from country to country. So pre-symptomatic testing still, it raised a host of ethical, legal, social, and even philosophical questions, and I think it continues to do so today. And it comes with some historical baggage. And I just, since I'm a historian, I just wanted to mention this a little bit about the connection with a movement called Eugenics, which probably most of you have heard of. This was a worldwide movement starting in the late 19th century and flourishing in the mid-20th century for better breeding, to improve the quality of society by controlling reproduction, encouraging those who were considered the fittest or superior to have a lot of children, and to discourage those who were considered less fit or unfit or inferior, or preventing them from having children at all. So there were different kinds of eugenics movements in different countries. So they varied quite a bit. And my country was one of the more severe, I would say, in sense of legalizing forcible sterilization in state hospitals. I think in some of the Latin American countries like Brazil and Argentina, the focus was more on prenatal care and kindergartens, and a much more humane approach to improving what would you say, improving society, basically, rather than this restrictive measures of immigration restriction, which is something here we had, and also sterilization. Of course, eugenics reached its apogee in Germany in the 1930s under the Nazis, with the murder, which started out, actually the Nazi program started out with psychiatric patients in hospitals, and that included, I think the estimate is 4,000 or 5,000 people who had Huntington's, and then went on to the program of mass extermination of the Jews and other ethnic minorities. But eugenics in most countries had a racist element to it. Certainly it did in the United States. But it was also focused on some hereditary, well, diseases that were considered hereditary, which we know today are not, like epilepsy or intellectual disability. But Huntington's chorea was a good example of a disease, of a severe disease that really was hereditary. And so the the followers of eugenics, I mean, eugenics was a very popular movement. This was not just a right-wing minority. It was accepted broadly on the left and the right, and very popular in society, in the United States and many European countries. And many geneticists and people interested in Huntington's were supporters of eugenics as well. Let's see, so that's the background. That's some of the background. Of course, from a eugenics point of view, one of the problems with Huntington's was that it didn't appear right away. You weren't born with it. And so then the question was, well, how do you know which one of the children of a parent is going to develop the disease? So there was always that mystery and suspense in the families that knew about it. And by the way, families themselves often recognized this disease. They might not have called it Huntington's chorea, but especially in small communities, that were even communities where people didn't move, and so there were generations of people living in the same place. People noticed, and the families noticed, oh, he's just like his grandfather. He's like his, they could see a condition handed down. So I think that the families, in a way, educated the doctors, or doctors that were local physicians also, like George Huntington in the United States was a third-generation physician in a little town where there were a family that had settled there very early with Huntington's, which they called St. Vitus' dance there. And both the families and the doctors observed this condition that kept reappearing in different generations. So the idea of a predictive test then was something that was talked about in the literature in the early 20th century. But the thing was, at that time, the geneticists and the physicians, the neurologists, they were thinking more about, we'll liberate those who don't have a disease or are not going to get it. And they just didn't seem to worry about the ones who found out that they were destined to get it. Well, we'll just tell them not to have children or sterilize them, and that's the end of the problem. Until the 1970s, when the family started getting involved and said, well, hey, wait a minute, it's a little more complicated than that, because approximately half the people are going to get a positive result for this. And what about their lives? So that's kind of my long-winded historical detour here to say that this idea of a predictive test has been around for a long time. And also there is often an assumption, well, if a new technology exists, of course you're going to take advantage of it, or you should take advantage of it. I think it's the families who really were started to thinking about both the people that would get the positive news and the positive news as well as the negative news. Positive in the sense of the more undesirable result, that is. So my sister and I think, from the beginning, have always tried to emphasize that predictive testing should be an individual choice and a personal decision, that nobody should be compelled to get tested who does not choose to do so freely, that it should be completely voluntary. And there should be no pressures on people to get a predictive test. But we also know that it's not quite so simple. For instance, in some ways, the pressures in some ways could be increasing because in order to participate in clinical trials. And then the question comes up, I've seen this discussed, do we have an obligation to get tested in order to help research? Is it socially irresponsible to, or selfish to refuse to get a test? Especially, you know, this is a relatively uncommon illness when it can be difficult to recruit people for clinical trials. So I don't have an easy answer to those questions. I would just say I have chosen not to get tested, at least so far, but I'm an old lady. So, you know, I'm probably beyond the point where I'm going to get the disease. And I could also change my mind at any time. You know, when you choose not to get tested, it's never absolute because tomorrow you can change your mind. I think if I had lived at a different time, if I'd been a different age, if I'd had children already, well, I did want to have children, but that's another story. There are many reasons for choosing differently. So I think that the context where the predictive testing is taking place is incredibly important. And again, it's my personal view that no matter how important the research is and how much we all want to support it, there are many ways to do so. And I do feel strongly that no one should feel compelled to get a predictive test or feel guilty or ashamed of not wanting to get this kind of knowledge, because you're the one that has to live with it for the rest of your life. You can't give that knowledge back. And another thing is that I think one of you alluded to, Huntington's is a very variable test. I mean, a very variable disease. The test can't tell you exactly when the symptoms might appear or which, you know, exactly which symptoms are going to be more prominent. So there's just a lot of unpredictability even when you take a test. So now I'm going to conclude by talking a little bit about my sister, because she has recently, after almost 50 years of being involved in advocacy and research, and maybe symptoms that have been emerging over the last 20 years. She now has come out about living with Huntington's disease. And for all of her knowledge, that was a very, very difficult thing to face. She's heard my talk, by the way. I practiced on it this morning, so she knows I'm saying these things. So we are now living in a new phase of this journey. And, you know, my feeling about her life is that she has lived such a magnificent life, dedicated to advancing science and research on HD, but also to building respect and solidarity, really, among all of us, and dignity to those living with HD and those who are living with the people living with Huntington's. So I think if we had had a choice, we certainly would never have chosen to have Huntington's in our family. But we didn't have a choice. It was just given to us by fate. And I think we were inspired by our dad to make the best life possible within those circumstances, not only for ourselves, but for others if possible too. And you know, as I said before, in our family, we each chose a different path. For my dad, it was mainly advocacy for research. For Nancy, it was advocacy, but it was also pursuing the science too, doing the research. And for me, it was after I got over, you know, running away from it for, I don't know, 15 years, I decided that the history of this disease was really interesting, and maybe that was something I could use my skills as a writer and a historian to try to advance knowledge in that way. And I think that that's a challenge for everybody in a family to find their way. I think Marjorie Guthrie once said that to me when I was in the phase of, I don't want to hear about this. She said, well, Alice, eventually, you know, you'll find your path to this. She was right. And I think by doing so, Nancy and I certainly feel, I mean, we've forged connections with so many amazing people and with each other too, and with a broader community. And so I just want to end by saying that sometimes people say in the HD community that family is everything. But for me, that statement can hurt. I find it painful because some of us have really tiny families. There are people, and some of us have no families at all because of Huntington's. You know, some of us have no siblings or we've lost our siblings. Some of us have no children or grandchildren or even nieces or nephews, all on account of Huntington's. But one thing that I have learned from Nancy and from so many other wonderful people, that we can make our own families. We can make new families that are not biological families. We can make intentional families that can support us and whom we can support and with whom we can travel this life together. And I know that I've met so many incredible people in the course of doing the research and just being part of Huntington's family and meeting lots of other people facing similar challenges. So that's what I hope we're doing today too, even if we have to do it on our computer screens. So I'm going to stop there.